Hello, and we are live. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So we're going to just leave it on this slide for a minute or so to let everybody join in the room, and then we'll get started with some introductions. If everybody could just go on the right-hand side, you should have a chat option. It would be great if you could introduce yourself. Where are you dialing in from today? We'd love to get to know you a little bit. Throughout the course of the presentation today, we highly encourage questions. So there's obviously you can put some in the chat. There's also a questions tab specifically that helps us sift through them. So if you have questions throughout, we'll take pauses throughout the presentation to answer some of your questions, and then we'll also have some time at the end for a Q&A. So yeah, so where have we got people calling from? Okay, so we've got Pal from Barcelona. Hey, Anna from Hamburg. Hey, Anna. I've got Dave McKenzie there. How's it going, Dave? Okay, great. Paris, Ireland. Okay, we've got people all over. Brilliant. Brendan, where are you calling in from today?
I'm in Portland, Oregon, on the west coast of the US.
And I'm in San Francisco. I actually did a road trip up through Oregon not so long ago. Beautiful place.
Quite rainy this time of year.
That's very true.
All right. Seasons to amaze me how, like, nowadays, look at this. We're all over the world. I think that's just amazing. Like,
it's crazy. I love it. It's great. I'm sure we'll get a lot of different questions coming from these different locations as well. Okay, brilliant. Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, New York, Andy, Maxence. Hey, everyone. Lou, Keith. Hey, Shelley. Hey, Martin. Okay, great. We've got a wide audience today.
Yeah.
Alrighty. So we'll go and get started. We've got a couple of slides before we get into the presentation, so that still leaves time for everyone to get in. As we said before, the questions tab over there on the right, please feel free to write in your questions. There will also be a couple of polls to get some of your ideas throughout the webinar. This is going to be very interactive. We'd love to engage with you, love to hear what you've got to say, any of your questions. So please don't be shy. Okay. Okie dokie. So for any of you who've never heard of CFO Connect before, we'll just start with a brief introduction as to who are we and what do we do here. So CFO Connect is a global community for modern finance leaders. There's actually over 5,000 members around the world. And as we can see from in the chat today, there truly is a global presence. It's a fantastic community. As a finance community, we host events and workshops just like this one. We also have a private Slack channel for CFOs, and we also produce a lot of content on our blog. And we've recently released a new podcast, which is called CFO Yeah! Which is has been amazing. We've had some really great guests on there. So if you want to check out the podcast, feel free to go to all of the standard podcast channels, and you'll be able to check us out. CFO Connect is powered by Spendesk. For those of you who haven't heard of Spendesk before, Spendesk is the go-to spend and expense management solution for modern finance teams. We enable your employees to make payments wherever they are in the world, whilst also empowering finance teams to keep complete control and visibility over what gets spent. Things like a receipt collection, reconciling payments, and reimbursing expense are all automated and save you time at the month end of close. It's a real game changer for finance teams, especially in this remote context, as we are all very familiar with. It can be a bit challenging. And also a last one on this, CFO Connect members can also try Spendesk for free. So if you are interested in spend management, please feel free to reach out or jump on our website at www.spendesk.com. So today's topic is going to be how to craft high growth pricing. So we are absolutely thrilled to introduce Brendan Dell with us today. We're going to go through high growth pricing. This is a topic that's on the minds of many finance leaders, especially those in the SaaS industry. I'm sure you're going to get lots of actionable insights out of today's presentation. As I said before at the beginning of the presentation, please do add your questions. We want to answer as many of them as possible. We'll take periodic pauses throughout the presentation to get to them. We're welcome today with Brendan. Brendan is an author, advisor, and go-to-market expert. He's worked with more than 100 early stage and enterprise brands to help them hone their go-to-market strategies. Something I'm also personally passionate about doing that myself, so I'm super excited for this topic today. He's also worked with sales programs, marketing strategies, and helping accelerate growth. Clients include Expedia, Cvent, HP, Accrue, Zeconomy, and hundreds more. So without further ado, I'd love to hand over the mic to yourself, Brendan.
Hey, thanks. Excited to chat through this today. So I guess to get started here, a little bit of context on me. As he said, I work in advising for go-to-market, and what that really looks like is three things, right? What are the go-to-market motions look like, sales and marketing, to be as effective as we can be? How do we monetize as effectively as we can? And then how do we message the value that we come up with? The way that we package and price our products, how do we message that most effectively to the market? And so what we're going to be talking about here is just what I've observed and learned working with all these different companies. And then most recently, I also had the benefit of working with a gentleman who's building, advising a company who's building a pricing optimization tool, understanding the rigor that they bring to their pricing strategy. So all this informs the lens of how I think about pricing, and hopefully we'll bring some value to how you guys think about it as well. Just perfect. So first of all, when we think about pricing, I think a lot of us, when we think about going to market and how do we grow, right? We tend to think of two things. We think, how do we acquire customers more effectively, right? Everybody wants to sell more. And how do we keep the folks we have? And often the first is the thing we think of first, right? We want to grow, we should sell more. Then we think secondarily about how do we keep the folks that we have? And then third is how do we monetize most effectively? So there's a stat floating around out there somewhere that early stage, I think it's tech companies, spend an average of 6 hours on pricing in the lifetime of their company. When you think about that, that's crazy. It's literally the way that you communicate value to your market, right, is pricing, but it's something we spend almost no time on. And the data supports that this is ineffective, right? So on the left there, you see percent impact to the bottom line, and then we see impact of improving each lever by 1%, monetization in the middle, right? It is the most meaningful thing that you can do is figure out the most effective way to monetize your products. So if we can take away nothing else from this presentation, it's to start to bring a degree of rigor and process to this as an ongoing function in your business, to continually look at pricing as something that needs to be attended to and optimized. So summarizing again, right? So if we can communicate one thing, it's that the way that you guys, as leaders in your companies, as folks related to finance, the rigor that you bring to this process is going to have a direct impact on your company's performance, okay? And there's three things we'll talk about in this presentation. One is the right way to price products, how to think about this. The second is how to price based on value, some high level on how to do this effectively. If you're in technology, you're likely trying to do some kind of value-based pricing right now, but most companies are not doing this well. And then three, what a high growth pricing process looks like, right? Pricing is not an event, and that's something that I really want to bang home today. It's not what I observe in the fastest growing companies is that they do not treat pricing as an event. They treat it as a process, okay? So to start this off, I'm going to tell you guys a little story. And this story comes from a book called Monetizing Innovation. If you have not read it, it is something that you should absolutely read. And it's about these two cars, the Porsche Cayenne and the Dodge Dart. So this gentleman, and I'm going to butcher this name, so I apologize. I've only ever read the name. I've never actually heard the name pronounced, but setting the stage a little bit. So we're going back to the early 1990s. And this gentleman I'm not even going to try his first name. Last name is King, and I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. But at the time, it's like 41 years old, and he was newly appointed CEO there, and he was among this new generation of automotive executives, right? And at the time, in the early 90s, Porsche, like a lot of car companies at that time, was in crisis, right? They had hit this inflection point. Their sales were way down, and they were speeding off a financial cliff, so to speak. See what I did there? So they had reached this point that a lot of companies come to where it was innovate or die. Let's click through here. So they started innovating, right? And they started cooking up plans at this time for the Cayenne, what then was just an idea, a sport utility vehicle. And if we step back and think about this, from a product development process, this doesn't make any sense. It's crazy for a sports car company who's losing market share to say, hey, let's make a car for soccer moms to drive around and put, you know, the kids in the back, right? It doesn't make any sense. But what was different about Porsche and was different about this strategy is Porsche already knew that this was going to be a success. And that's because they started with price and then went to product. And this is a critical point for this presentation. So when they started developing the Cayenne, they started by asking themselves 3 questions, okay? One is, do Porsche buyers want an SUV? The second is, how much would they pay for it? And the third is, what did they value and what price? And I want to take a second to pause on these last two beats here. Most of us, when we go to market, we start with innovation, right? We start with, we've got this cool new widget, or we've got this suite of features. How much do competitors charge for things generally like this? And how much do we then think we can get? Should we be a little bit higher than competitors? We're a little more premium, a little bit lower, right? And we start with ourselves in mind. High growth companies, and this is a cross-functional thing. This is not just a pricing thing, but it's critically important in pricing because almost no one does this. High growth companies start with the user, start with what they will pay, and then they work backwards. So let's talk about what this actually looked like in product development. So I come from the lens of software and technology. That's where a lot of my experience is. And what you see again and again in software and technology is people, they've got a laundry list of features and then, or things that they think the customer wants, and they start assigning prices and value to things based on what they think is most unique or individual to them. They lead with what they see as the longer lasting light bulb for their company. What Porsche did is the opposite of this, and it's what I'd encourage all of you to do. So at the time, this is the early 90s, Porsche had this 6-speed manual transmission that was, you know, all the rage in their sports cars. What they did is they went to customers and asked questions like, how much would you pay? So first of all, do you want an SUV from Porsche? Second of all, what kind of things would you value in that SUV? What would you pay for it, right? And so yes, what would you pay for it? when you roll that backwards, right, what you're doing is you're creating a recipe for a profitable product, right? Because instead of saying we think our 6-speed transmission, for example, is the best, and building this product that then has to inflate a price, they're saying, what do people actually want? What do they care about? What values do they assign to those things? And they can reverse engineer a very, very profitable product, right? They built, clicking through, the product around the price. So what was the result of this? Starting with a user-centric approach to pricing, starting with price, then working to product. The Cayenne is the highest profits per car in the industry at that time. They paid down huge amounts of debt. And at the time of the writing of this book, it was half of Porsche's sales. That's insane, right? For a company that was solely sports cars before. So let's take the counter position to this, okay? The Dodge Dart, and another name that I'm going to totally butcher when we say this, but we're gonna go with Marchione, okay? So Dodge Dart was Fiat Chrysler's entry into compact cars. And this is a really important segment if you're in the automotive industry. At this time, 1 in 6 cars sold in the US were compact cars. And a quote from this gentleman to 60 Minutes was something like, any company unable to succeed in the compact category is doomed. So they were fighting against similar market forces. They were trying to figure out how do we stay relevant and profitable and so forth. And this was a big play for them. So what Dodge did was the opposite. And this is what so many technology companies do in a world where 75% of venture-backed companies fail. This is obviously a ineffective strategy. So they started with engineering, right? What's the cool thing that we can build that we think is really neat? They quote, at this time they ran this commercial that they were kicking the finance guys out of the room, meaning we're going to spend whatever it takes to make the best compact car we can. We don't care, right? So they developed this thing based on what they thought was cool. They tweaked and tweaked and tweaked and tweaked and tweaked. And then they put a price on it to try to compete based on what others in the market were doing and where they thought they could fit with this new shiny object. They took a them-centric approach instead of pricing, then product. And the result of this was, as you can expect, a flop. They sold 25,000 cars, which was a quarter of what was predicted. And I think it was Fortune magazine that called it the year's second biggest new product flop. So if we can take one thing away from this story, right? The first principle of high growth pricing is that you start with your customer's willingness to pay, and then you work backward to innovation, packaging, product, and so forth. And I see this with pricing as a broader strategic issue in terms of how you go to market. And this quote from I love, because it shows the way they think, right? So the quote, right? We're not competitor obsessed, we're customer obsessed. We start with the customer and work backwards. If you sit in rooms where pricing is discussed, the most common thing that happens is you get up on the screen, the three top competitors, and they go, well, so, the leader's pricing here and they're over there, and we're kind of premium here and then maybe over there. And they mash up pricing based on how they think they fit in the market, right? How they see they fit compared to other people. The highest growth companies I see do not start with the competition. They start with the customer, and they package and deliver value based on that. And this comes to how you do marketing, how you develop products, and so forth. The second principle of high growth pricing that I want to talk about here is pricing based on value. So there's essentially three common approaches to pricing. Cost plus is something that has long been used in retail, right? That's you have baseline costs and you try to get X margin above it. Competitor based is where you, again, like we talked about, this is what I see the most in technology, and you see it a lot in other sectors as well, but you look at generally what people are charging for things that you deem like yours, and then you try to go a little higher or a little lower depending on how you try to position yourself in the market. And third is value based, and this is the user-centric approach, right? This is aligning what you charge with what customers value. So defining terms, basing a product or services price on how much the target consumer believes it's worth. That's what value pricing is. And a lot of folks in technology would say, and services as well might say, they're pricing based on value. But what they're really doing is competitive pricing and trying to get a really high premium on it. And so they're not aligning with what they're charging with how customers yield or see value in what they're doing. So we'll talk about how to build a user-centric approach, customer-centric approach to value-based pricing. There's two key terms we're going to walk through here. One is segmentation, and two is a value metric. And these are terms that were really hammered into me by the founder of the pricing optimization firm that I was advising. And when I saw the power of these and experimentation and their ability to drive lifted businesses when implemented well, it really drove into me how important this is to get right and to continually look at these two factors and optimize on an ongoing basis. So let's walk through each of these here. First of all, segmentation. So segmentation is basically breaking up your end user customer base into different groups and aligning how those individual groups find value and charging appropriately. The reason this is important is a number of things. One, there's an 80-20 relationship between segments and the value to your business in most companies. You'll see companies, I see this, one is coming to mind right now that I won't name. They insist on maintaining presence in the SMB market, even though 80% of their revenue is derived from the enterprise. And it takes this massive team to keep SMB going, even though it's of almost no value to the company. They're not user-centric, right? They're saying we want to be everywhere instead of saying where is the customer getting value, right? So the customer, A customer-centric mindset looks at value for a given segment, and then it prices and delivers that value uniquely, or importantly, chooses not to deliver at all if it cannot align the value they're delivering to the value of the customer, because focus is trade-offs, right? So keep going. The most effective way to get to effective segmentation is quantified buying personas. And this is the foundation of your entire pricing strategy. And what I've observed again and again is high growth companies do this properly, and those that have a hard time aligning their value to customers do this improperly. And so I'll show you what good looks like. I'll show you what bad looks like. So personas are something that probably everyone's seen in marketing. And it's something that marketing generally, I mean, it can work fine the way that it's done in those use cases, but they're generally done wrong. They deal in vague generalities, like, you know, administrator Alan likes this and that and the other thing, and they're just lumping people in based on vague ideas about what people in a given role or given demographic like, and try to put a face to a name. But when we're doing pricing especially, this is not effective. So effective segmentation starts with quantified, research-driven buying personas. The example here is from a company called Profitwell that you guys can all look up. The gentleman there is extremely bright with pricing. Recommend all their resources. But what you'll see here is this is not as pretty, is not as cool looking. You could make it pretty if you wanted to, but is specific and actionable. So what we're doing is we're going to the market and we're doing research. And this is something that a lot of companies don't want to slow down to do, right? Which is why you end up with competitive pricing, picking one against the other on a screen. But the net result that you'll see in terms of lift, if you do this right, is remarkable. So you're breaking the market up into segments, which is going to be different for every business, how you break this up. And what you're doing is reverse engineering how people see value and the price, or the the features that align to that value and drive that value. So we can see two personas on the left and circled in the little pink box there. What we're doing is looking at not a vague generality of administrator Alan is trying to improve his workflow, right? We're looking at this and saying, okay, based on research, we know that table stakes Tony here highly values Salesforce integrations, highly values Chrome, et cetera, right? We also know what the value of these individual segments are to the customer. What's the cost of customer acquisition? How long do they last? And so forth. So high growth pricing is going to look at all of these factors and design pricing packages and so forth that aligns with the value and how people see and realize value for a given product.
And Brendan, maybe a quick question here on the segmentation. How do you actually define creating a segment? Are you defining this by certain industries or particular use cases? I think this is, for example, in my experience in go-to-markets, when you're doing a segmentation, it's very easy just to start with like LinkedIn categories, information and technology or manufacturing, because it's quite easy to do searches by that. But is that the right way? Is that the best way to segment a market? Or are there more appropriate ways to segment, such as a use case or the way that they may interact with your product or the pain point?
Yeah, I love that question. So depending on what you're selling, this is one of those it depends kind of unsatisfying answers. But I think depending on what you're selling, use case can be more effective. Function can be more effective even, right? Because if you're selling into enterprises, functional areas, obviously, right, can be companies into themselves. And industries can be useful because a lot of times use cases will align to industries. So I think you have to break it down, again, based on value. And a lot of time that aligns to how are people using this, as you say, in terms of use cases, and how are they defining that value? User testing is someone I work with, and the value for a UX team, right, is that they're looking to scale their efforts. The value for a product team is they're looking to have fewer product mistakes downstream, right? And so you align that value differently. In that case, it's functional areas that makes most sense to define, and it's less important to define by industry, because a lot of those teams will still answer similar questions for their organizations.
Yeah, very clear. Thank you. Next slide.
Yeah, next slide. Just keep it going. So when you're looking at segmentation, this is going to that question, here are a few of the key questions you want to answer. Who are your highest value customers? There's a variety of ways to answer this, right? But a lot of times companies will have a gut instinct on this as well. You'll ask leaders like, who makes up 80% of your revenue? And they're like, boom, right? They know the answer to this. What do they value? Which means conducting research to understand what features, what value they're getting. Like, so not only features, but what end state are they actually getting out of using this product versus what you think. A lot of times in software specifically, we have lofty goals for how people, like I'll use Gong as an example. Gong is a tool that gives you insight into how, I should use a finance example. I don't have one top of mind. My apologies. So Gong is, I'll summarize instead and just say that a lot of times we have lofty aspirational goals in terms of the value our software delivers. But a lot of times what this comes down to is time savings and efficiencies and so forth, right? And so we need to understand the true value people are getting and price, package, position based on the actual value versus our perceived value. What are they willing to pay, right? And we'll get to how to determine that in an effective way in a bit. And then how does this map to company goals, meaning we're trying to grow, right? So high growth companies are going to focus and double down where their big opportunities are, and they're going to be willing to let those lesser opportunities go. And the inability to focus is another thing that I see again and again as especially, I mean, at all stages of companies, but especially in early stage companies, we want to go to everyone is a really common thing, and they just do not have the resources to be effective in that way, and it erodes growth.
These are really great points there, Brendan. There was one thing that struck me as you were going through that in terms of, what do they value and what are they willing to pay. One thing with a lot of products, and we're talking about features versus what's the job that can be done or achieved. Yep. If you use an example from Spendesk, we help capture receipts on payments and automate that. You could argue that, are you paying for the value of automating receipt capture, or is it what's the job to be done? In Europe, that may be to avoid regulatory punishment by not having being able to claim tax back and things like that. So what are you actually valuing or putting the value on? Is it the actual feature or is it the end outcome? I think that's something that can also change the perspective on the value to the customer. What's your thoughts on the way that you would calculate what the value is on?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think a lot of times, especially when early stage software companies, for example, are looking for product market fit, they're looking at again, this aspirational idea of the strategic value that a tool can drive. But most people adopt tools because of some pain point, as you say, a job to be done, right? There's something that they can't do as effectively. Like the analogy we use in marketing all the time is, if you want to lose weight, right? Someday, I'll get there. But if your back hurts really bad, you're going to go get Tylenol, right? Like, you got to find something to kill the pain. So figuring out what's the pain you're solving for and what's that job to be done, which is a great term, is usually the most effective way to position value.
We've got two questions from the audience here. So the first one from Jan, I hope I pronounced that correctly, or Jan, I apologize if I mispronounced that. The question here is, if you are in a new market, how do you go about the price discovery process? For example, without a product or market benchmarks. I think on the focus on the pricing, you're saying the risk is to set the price too low, trying to grow market share. But I think there's also a great question. When you are looking at a segment or it's a completely brand new product in an unknown market, how do you even start kind of going about trying to discover that process? Here we've got the questions to ask, but how do you think about mapping that out in the beginning stages?
Yeah, so that's a big question. I think that there's a couple things there. One is first of all, you can still look at a broader industry segment to get some sense in terms of anchors, right? Of like, what are people generally charging for things, to give you some anchor point. And that can give you data points. The second piece of this is you have to run real-time experiments. And this is something we'll talk about. I am not, and people will argue with me on this, but I am not a big fan of surveys because, and in methods like conjoint analysis, which is just like a fancy way of saying surveys, what those techniques do is tell you what people say they will do. They do not show you what people will actually do. And if you ask people if they want something, they'll say yes. But when you ask them to get their credit card out, it's different. So running real-time experiments into segments is how you start to get a sense of, and also you may need to price a little bit lower at the beginning to get some traction in a practical sense. Right.
Well, you just said there about putting it into practical terms, a survey versus actually putting the a money or credit card behind it. That's also one of the arguments that they talk about in monetizing innovation as well, about the freemium versus the premium model. When you have a freemium model, the feedback that you get from customers is often not very accurate, because there isn't actually a vested interest in the product. There's a second question here, and this one is from Caitlin. So would you survey your existing users or prospective users for this initially?
Yeah, so you can. And some people will argue that, again, that testing, and I'll talk about this in the third section, the third part of the presentation here, that testing is not effective because, well, not that it's not effective, but basically it can create sort of a moral complication with trying different prices with different people and etc. Again, my problem, you can survey people, but all surveying does is tell you what people say they're going to do, and their real life behavior is usually very, very different, which is why it's better to run real tests and see what people actually do.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the questions. Keep them coming. We're going to try and get to all of them that we can. Next slide.
Yes, next slide.
All right.
Okay, so the first thing we talked about here was segmentation and the importance of creating quantified buying personas based on research in your market. The second thing I want to talk about is value metric here. So a value metric in SaaS is the thing that you charge for. And this is a technology-centric topic, but it's very important. And you can align this in a lot of different ways. You could do this in services and so forth. A really common, so this sales page here is Salesforce. Should have included their logo here for citation purposes. What they do is charge based on user seats. And in many cases, this is the most common value metric that SaaS and technology companies use, right? Is usually some kind of user-based pricing, the number of people using it. And in many, many cases, this is, and I'm sorry that is so small also, that is not the most effective way to do it. So for Salesforce, right, more salespeople using the platform, ideally more value you derive as an organization. For many companies, let's take like Canva, which is like a graphic design tool. Just having more people on the platform does not necessarily mean you're getting more value for it. So when you look at how to price, getting the value metric right and experimenting with value metrics is critically important. And it's something I've observed again and again in high growth companies, that those that grow the fastest most closely align to value. Let's go to the next slide. So again, yeah, we can skip over that. So effective value metrics. This is an example from HubSpot. That's a marketing automation tool. What they do is align their pricing to contacts. As a marketer, right, the more people you're communicating with, if you're doing things right, the more value you should be able to derive from their platform, which means that their value grows as your usage grows, their value grows, and the two are aligned, right? So effective value metrics. When you think about high growth pricing, one, it's easy to understand. Nobody should have to ask you a bunch of questions to understand how the values align. Two, it should tie to how customers realize value. And three, it should grow with them.
That's before we got on air, Brendan, we were talking about the Michelin tire example. I think that's a great example of this effective value metric. Can we share that example?
Yeah, why don't you share it?
Sure.
Yeah.
So in the book that Brendan was mentioning earlier, Monetizing Innovation, which is a fantastic read, and they give lots and lots of case studies if you're looking to get your teeth into things. They give the example with Michelin tires. It was either Dunlop or Michelin, I have to refresh my memory. But basically they created a new tire that was had all the bells and whistles. It went further. It basically was the best tire in the market. And let's say the average cost for a tire is $100. They wanted to charge $150 for this tire. Now, when they actually released it, it basically was a big flop. They didn't really understand this value metric. And so they basically pivoted and they looked at these value metrics. They say, well, what do our customers actually care about? They care about the number of miles that the tire can actually go. And so one of the key benefits of this tire is it could go 5 times the amount of miles. So obviously, they then went out and changed the value metric in the way they price. And instead of doing it per tire, they charge per mile. And obviously, if you have 5x the number of miles, and okay, your price may be per tire more expensive, but per mile it's just got suddenly super cheap. So although the amount of money that they're going to get for their tires has just gone up, to the customer, when you're pricing on their value metric, it's actually gone down, and now you're the most competitive one in the market. I just thought that was a great example, when looking at these value metrics.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful example, and I think it brings home the importance of testing these things out, right? And working to understand how your customers do derive value, because if they would have just stuck, right, with the premium pricing without tying it to value, they never would have had the success there. And that's true. I see that again and again with companies where they're focused on themselves rather than how customers realize the value.
All right.
Awesome. So summarizing this section, high growth pricing means focusing on value and differentiation rather than market rates and comparison. User, right? Price, then product. Third thing here is treat pricing as a process. I'm going to tell you guys another little story that it comes from the company I was advising on their pricing optimization tool. We will slide forward here. Perfect. So for those in startup land, they know Carta. Carta is a cap table management solution, and the story comes from this gentleman, so I will not claim it as my own. What he was able to do working for this company is increase their prices 20% and drive a 40% lift in revenue. And how is this possible, right? How do you just lift prices like that? The answer is a really simple one. Rather than relying on flawed statistical analysis or guessing, they implemented a culture of real-time testing. They made pricing a process that was focused on how do people value us, how do they realize that value, and how do we deliver that value price package, position that most effectively so that we can get the best return on our investment. We'll talk about how to create this kind of a culture.
So what you're saying there, Ben, is you can increase the price, but it's not just the increase in the price that's going to increase the revenue. It's also going to increase the sales because of a better fit and overall increase the revenue that way.
Yeah, the nuance there. So there's more nuance to the story, basically, there that we don't have time to dive into here. But what they were able to just flat out raise prices, and there was very little actual resistance to it. They were able to do this by introducing segmentation into their pricing models, and it drove up revenue because the way they aligned, they introduced segmentation model, the segmentation and value metrics, and then by better aligning those two things, they were able to drive higher prices and more revenue.
Wow.
So what you're going to see most of the time when people try to figure out how to do pricing is surveying. And someone asked this question earlier. The name is escaping me. Apologize. And a lot of pricing folks will evangelize conjoint, again, surveying, basically. In my experience, it's not effective to go about things this way. You can get some information, but again, people's actual behavior versus what they say they're going to do is very different. If you do want to create models, and there's some, we won't go into all this right now, but there's something called market replication models, which actually makes people choose in real time, but it's a simulation. And if you want to simulate versus actually have to make people commit to dollars, you can look into market replication models. It's a far more accurate predictor of how people are going to behave in the real world. And then real-time testing is the best yet. And you can do this in transactional models where people buy online, and you can do this in rep-driven models. You can do this with cars. You can do this with anything. So what I've seen, again, with high growth companies, when they approach pricing, is they iteratively and consistently look at all the elements of pricing. And they're testing these things on an individualized basis and a rolling basis to figure out, what do customers value? How do they roll? What are they willing to pay for that value? And how do we play with different levers in order to get the highest growth? These are 9 of the things that I've seen have the largest impact, with starting with segmentation and value and experimenting with value metric, In addition to also, by the way, just try raising your prices 10% with individualized segments and seeing what happens, as being the most effective. So pricing is a process. This is what it looks like to, not a very pretty slide, I'll have to work on this. This is what it looks like to make pricing a process in your company. So one, you're going to start with what to test. And I would, again, encourage you to start with figuring out what people want, what do they value, and then value metric. You're going to build your personas, which is research to figure out how to put the jobs to be done, right? How it aligns to the value you deliver. You're going to create a hypothesis. You're going to try where you can to remove confounding variables from the equation. And what this means is, and I'll use an example from a rep-driven sales process, for example, if you're going to come up with hypotheses and test a new value metric, you're going to want to choose 2 reps with similar performance, right? So that you're not having a low performing rep and a high performing rep delivering this experiment. And as much as you can, you're going to try to remove these confounding variables. You can then start by either raising prices, segmenting more effectively, or testing new value metrics, with the value metric often being the highest left, and then commit to ongoing optimizing, just like you do in sales, marketing, product, or operations, right? You wouldn't just say, okay, well, our teams are orged, we're done, we're never going to think about org structure again. No, you're going to look at it as you grow, right? And pricing should be treated the same way, and it should be done iteratively on an ongoing basis, not once a year or once every 3 years when you do a new big product release. And the reason is that data point in the beginning, right? It's the most effective way to drive growth. So that's restating. A common question I get when talking about this is, how would this work for us? We're in a lower volume kind of a scenario. We charge a lot of money for our products, so we're relying on sales reps. So in lower volume scenarios where you can't get necessarily statistically significant examples, you do need to have enough transaction volume so that you can find some level of trends. And if you're dealing in a rep-driven model, you're going to want to try to find reps with similar levels of performance so that you can remove those confounding variables wherever possible. Again, that's just a way of saying try to make the test as similar as possible with only that one variable changing so you can find the correlation. Summarizing, high growth pricing means implementing real-time process of testing rather than assuming competitive analysis or just listening to the loudest voice in the room, which is also a common way that these prices get set. Somebody has a very strong opinion, and so it gets implemented despite what may be most effective. So the 3 things we talked about: start with price, then product. Focus on value to the customer, implementing segmentation, and testing your value metrics, and then iterative, implement a culture of iterative and real-time testing so you can figure out how you deliver value, how customers realize value, and get the most possible, the highest possible price for what you do.
Wow, that was awesome. That was a lot of actionable stuff in there. For everyone that's in the chat, please feel free to add in your questions, and we'll go through some of those right now. Thank you, firstly, so much for going through that, Brendan. One of the questions that we get quite often when using this kind of iterative approach to pricing, I think a lot of people are often scared of testing different pricing in the fear that in the market they may have different customers that are introduced to different pricing, and that may cause friction as they speak with each other. How do you view that problem, and what would be your approach to getting around that?
So it very rarely happens. So it's a common fear. Customers do not generally speak with each other. And if it does happen, you just honor the lower price. It's in all the years doing this, I've almost never seen it come up, even though it's a common fear. People just don't talk to each other that, how much did you pay for this? It's just not that common. And pricing is not 100% transparent in general. So I would say don't let that fear stand in your way. And so I'll to give you the other side of the coin, people who would argue for surveying and so forth, that's one of the things they'll call out is that, well, there's this sort of moral issue with charging people differently. But I don't see that at all. And discounting if you discount for a discrete period of time and then go back to normal prices, this is doing the exact same thing, right? You're saying we're going to give you a cheaper price right now, but not later. So I don't see it.
And also, like when you look at the growth of your revenue and growth of market share, it's exponential. Exponential growth is always at the end. So you got to think that like 99% of your potential interaction with the market is going to be in years time, especially for startups, right? So all that experimentation in the early days, it's with a very small percentage of the market. We have another question here from Jeffrey. How do you assess willingness to pay if not with surveys?
Yeah, so it's what I said. You're gonna assess. So at that stage, you are using surveys, right? You are having conversations with customers. And the other way you can do this is you can simulate this using things like market replication models, but you are starting with conversations, right? So that's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, even from my background in sales and in the early stage go-to-markets, I think, even just having a pricing that you can present on a screen and gauge in reaction is going to be, the second best thing to actually trying to close a customer.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's have a question from Mary. Thanks for the presentation. Can you talk more about flawed statistical models versus real-time testing and the market replication model?
Yeah. So essentially it comes down to two things. You're asking what people will do or observing what they've done, right? Which is historical, or you are asking people to make decisions in real time. So conjoint is basically a method that's saying, what would you do under these conditions? And they give you specific, trying to think of a simple way. You could actually Google to get a really in-depth answer to this question, conjoint versus market replication models. But essentially conjoint is asking you to evaluate based on discrete factors, how much do you value this versus that and so forth. Whereas market replication models are basically creating real life market scenarios. Like let's say they're you would use a simulator to put the Coke on the shelf next to the Sprite and see what do people actually choose. And you can do this with, you can do this with cars, you can do this with software, etc. So it's looking at what people actually do versus what they say they would do, or looking at what they historically have done.
We've got a question from Manuel. What's the better way for market entry, in your opinion? Starting with high price and decrease if necessary, or starting with a too low pricing and then try to increase?
Yeah, I mean, that there's so much in that question. I think it depends on so many factors for your own business and sort of what you can sustain also in terms of how long can you go without making sales and so forth, and how you're trying to position in the marketplace. I don't have a good clean answer to that question, honestly. I think it really depends on what you're trying to do. I think that a lot of companies do get themselves in the trap of unsustainable pricing in an effort to just, I see this even with like not high growth kind of businesses, but mom and pop businesses. They go in a lot and try to just price. They'll say they'll make it up on volume or make it up later, and they never get to that later, and the business doesn't succeed. So I guess as I'm talking this through, I would say try to go with higher pricing and then see what you can do.
And with the higher pricing, lower pricing question, I mean, there's, I think people are scared to go too low because they think they can't then price higher after. But again, to that point of market share and the people that you're actually presenting to, it's such a tiny amount that problem doesn't really occur outside of maybe a couple of interactions. And also the price, you can change this on. It's not just, is it higher or lower? It can also be the way you structure pricing. So I think the key is, as you said, Brendan, just to keep iterating. We have another question here, which has been upvoted a lot by Jan. And so you did cover this briefly, but I think they're looking for sort of more in-depth of an answer. So how do you iterate in the enterprise market where you have fewer customers?
Yeah. So you're saying selling into the enterprise market? Is that the question?
How do you iterate in the enterprise market where you have fewer customers? So I guess you also want to test lots of variables, but you don't necessarily have deal flow to go through and test those.
Yeah. So if you're going, so first of all, a lot of enterprise deals are so bespoke anyway that that's a sales driven thing. It's really listening to value, right? And understanding what that customer's unique value is in the same way, but in a micro level, right? Like, how do you align what that customer's trying to do with what you offer? Also, enterprises are hugely vast, right? If you say Microsoft, right, that's a one word, but it's actually like 1,000 companies under one umbrella is what that is in practice. So there often you can get to the statistically significant amounts. And then the third piece of that is that it's often rep driven versus in a consumer market where it's, or like an SMB SaaS model that it's like buy, put your credit card in and buy online. So it's getting reps to deliver discrete experiments and then iterating based on what you learn. And a lot of times you'll get, this is not statistically significant, but you'll get really clear feedback, like 5 to 7, 10 transactions. You'll start to see really clear trends. It doesn't always take like, 100 or 1,000 transactions to start to see what's happening.
Absolutely. We've got a question here from Martin. How do you best perform the tests in a B2B market and not in a consumer market? Or maybe another way to phrase that is, what is the difference in these iterative tests between B2B and B2C markets?
Well, I think the variables that have the biggest determiner can change in terms of how you position value, because some of it, like buying something off the shelf, is a different buying process than buying a piece of software. But it really is the same, that you're looking at the 9 elements we covered, figuring out what do we think is likely to have, creating a hypothesis around what do we think is most likely to have the highest impact on pricing, and then testing. And in a B2B environment, you're just empowering reps to deliver these experiments, and you can either communicate or not communicate with them that they're delivering these. People will work off like a deal desk or a price sheet, or however you guys structure it. You deliver those experiments, and you just close the loop and start to see what's working.
A question here from Malika. When do customers usually ask for the help in pricing strategy? What is the best time to get advice?
Like at what stage of company growth?
I imagine so, yeah.
Yeah, I think the best time to start optimizing your pricing is when you do have some traction and some, let's call it product market fit, so that you have some sense of, again, you can start optimizing. Otherwise, you're at that stage where you're trying to go to the market and understand what do they value, what are the jobs to be done, and how are we going to design the price first and then the product. So I think there is no best time. It's when you're ready to start iterating.
Yeah, there's a fantastic book called 4 Steps to an Epiphany, which talks about the 4 steps in the commercial aspect of a go-to-market. Look at that exactly. You've got to get the product market fit. Does the product actually solve the pain? Is it a good solution fit to the pain fit? And then think about monetizing. We've got another question here from Robert Collins. So how do you encourage salespeople who are paid commissions to test pricing adjustments which may result in a lost sale?
Yeah, that's always a tough one. And I've seen this done in a variety of ways. Sometimes people will compensate. That is something that companies will do depending on where they're at. The second thing is you don't tell them. You simply alter the information they're given and tell them this is where, this is what the price is right now. And they deliver it just like they would deliver any other quote. And the third way is you just have to find people who are willing to experiment and find people who are basically willing to be team players. It's sort of a difficult question though, and it's a good one, and it's something you just got to handle on a case-by-case basis based on your company and sort of the research you have available and so forth.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for your questions. Thank you everybody for joining all over the world. We really appreciate your time and definitely the interaction. Thank you very much to Brendan. It was a fantastic presentation. I personally learned a lot. I hope the audience did too. In the last couple of minutes, is there any parting remarks that you'd like to leave with the audience? And if not, is there where can they best find you and reach out to you?
Yeah, I think if there's any parting thought here, it's just wherever you can, start with the customer and work backwards. I think that is the key thing that I see again and again with high growth companies in pricing and product and everything else. And where can they find me? BrendanDell.com is my website, and LinkedIn. You can find me Brendan Dell. Connect with me there.
Awesome. And for everybody that's here, we can pass over the presentation, and we'll make a couple of notes on book recommendations that happened in the chat and so on and so forth. For anyone that wants to check out Spendesk, it's spendesk.com. If anyone wants to join the CFO Connect community, if you're in the US, please go to cfoconnect.us. If you're in Europe, please go to cfoconnect.eu and check out the future webinars and events that we'll be hosting. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.